Hello everyone, welcome to your library at home. My name is Rebecca. I'm part of the public programs team here at the State Library of New South Wales. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging that I live and work on Gadigal land, the traditional custodians of this land on which knowledge has been exchanged for millennia. We also celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal culture and language across New South Wales, and I take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present, and especially emerging. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who may be joining us online this evening. I'm very pleased to be welcoming you all today to what is sure to be a great conversation between contributors from Second Sydney, the latest anthology published by the Sydney Review of Books. Moderated by Anthony McCris, featuring Felicity, Etta and Sheila, who will discuss new directions in non-fiction, the specific possibilities of essay writing in both the richness and limitations of the designation Western Sydney writer. We'll have time to take questions from you this evening, so I do encourage you all to use the Q&A feature of Zoom, located usually at the bottom of your screen. Please don't hesitate to send through your questions at any stage throughout the discussion, and Tony will certainly be able to facilitate a Q&A session with the panelists after the talk. I'd like to now introduce to your screens our moderator, Tony McCris.
Okay, and here I am. Hi, everyone.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Thanks for that introduction. I'm zooming in from Darragland, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. We've got our three writers who've written about our great second city, is it? We'll talk about that a bit tonight, Western Sydney. The three writers tonight are Felicity Castagna, who won the 2014 Prime Minister's Literary Award for Young Adult Fiction for her novel, The Incredible Here and Now, and was shortlisted for the Children's Book Council of Australia and New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards, and it was adapted for the stage by the National Theatre of Parramatta. Her collection of short stories, Small Indiscretions, was named an Australian Book Review Book of the Year, as a mouthful. Most recent novel, No More Boats, was shortlisted for the 2018 Miles Franklin Literary Award, and the Prize and the 2018 New South Wales Premier's Literary Multicultural Award. That's a real swag. Congratulations, Felicity. We also have tonight another really fascinating writer, Ada Günaydın, who's a Turkish Australian writer. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney, and her creative non-fiction explores class mobility, intergenerational trauma, and diaspora. You can find her work in Meanjin, the Sydney Review of Books, the Lifted Brow, and other places. She's been a finalist for the Queensland Literary Awards and the Scribe Non-Fiction Prize, and was the University of Melbourne Australian Centre's Denny O'Hearn Fellow 2018-19. Really impressive achievements. And last but absolutely not least is, just let me scroll. Sheila Knock-Pham. She's a writer, editor, and producer working in radio, print, online, and film. She's written for a wide range of literary and mainstream publications, as well as for institutions including the State Library of New South Wales and Museum of Contemporary Art. She recently served as a judge for the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards, and she's held digital and editorial roles at the ABC, and he continues to produce radio documentaries and stories for ABC National Radio. Most recently, Tongue-Tied and Fluent, a 5-year series exploring multiculturalism in Australia. She lives on Darug country with her husband and 2 children, and that's where I live too. Okay, guys, just a little brief intro from me, and then we'll get into the questions. I've got to say how much I loved reading this anthology that's been so expertly curated by Luke Carman and Katrina Menzies-Pike, who are doing brilliant things at the Sydney Review of Books. Now, I've lived in Parramatta here in Western Sydney for the last 10 years, and I thought I knew this place to some degree. Well, not as much as I thought. The mark of a really good book, of really good writing like yours, is that it changes the way you look at the world. You see things differently after you've read it. And that's what this collection did for me. Earlier this week, I was walking across Parramatta Square en route from the Westfield to my guilty pleasure Beat Disc Records, where you can get really great vinyl. The square, as usual, was buzzing with people, that great diverse crowd that makes up Parramatta. And because I'd read the anthology and your pieces, I got this feeling that I understood them that little bit better, that I knew them that little bit better, what they might think and feel about things in general, and in particular, what they might think and feel about this place we call Australia. So for me, it's a great pleasure to have a conversation with all of you who brought the place and the people to life so vividly. Okay, now, just my first general question to you all, and pitch in whoever wants to go first. Your essays, as all the contributions to the anthology do, read as a series of wonderful deep dive reflections on Western Sydney and broader matters too. But particularly Western Sydney, this complex layered place that's all too often reduced to well-worn cliches. And Felicity, you kind of point them out quite well, and I might leave you to maybe identify a little more what those cliches might be. But just generally to you all, given this sort of context, what guided your particular approach to writing Western Sydney? Felicity, you're on mute.
Sorry. I think I'm still trying to work out how to write Western Sydney, and I'm sure I'm not the only one in that boat. I think I began writing about Western Sydney, or Parramatta really. I've never really written about Western Sydney. I've only ever really written about Parramatta. But I think I began in the wrong way, in that I was thinking about the way that Western Sydney itself is not just a place, but an idea. And I was trying to write kind of for or against that idea. And even in something like The Incredible Here and Now, I was very conscious of the fact that, like this chapter kind of writes authentically to that kind of idea of what Western Sydney is. And in this chapter, I'm rebelling against it. And, I'm trying to have a bit of a balance here. But it's the wrong approach, because you're writing, for or against an idea that's already far too simplistic. So in my later writing, and I don't pretend that I've mastered it yet, but I'm trying more and more to just kind of, do as, Rebecca Solnit and Virginia Woolf and Teju Cole, who I quote in my essay, do, and just kind of sit in the dark and be comfortable with that kind of uncertainty, and the idea that you can't ever really authentically capture the whole of the place, but I can think about those small specific moments in this place that mean something to me and mean something to my characters, and that make me feel this place, and hopefully make my readers feel this place.
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting idea. That, what is Western Sydney? I tend to associate it with Parramatta because I've lived here for a while. Very interesting notion. But Ada, Sheila, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll add something here. I think when I was introduced to the idea that there's this thing about Western Sydney writing, I remember it was in 2007, so I would have been about 26 then. But I instinctively rejected the idea, actually. Like, I wasn't very interested in joining in any of the literary movements. I don't come from a literary background myself, but I was certainly a big reader, and I had written as well. But I think the other thing I've been thinking about in preparation for this talk is that, basically I had been working in many parts of Western Sydney by that age already as well. Like, I'd worked across Southwest Sydney. I'd also worked in Penrith. I had spent years volunteering at Lifeline in Parramatta at that stage. So I had quite a lot of different experiences across this idea of like this geographic area called Western Sydney. And I didn't buy this kind of reductive understanding even from the get-go, I think. Like, so I guess if I was to identify with somewhere, I would say I'm from Southwest Sydney, for one thing. I think Southwest Sydney, where I've grown up, around the Bankstown area and the Kambah and those areas, are incredibly like multicultural areas. Whereas when I went and worked in Penrith for a while, you know, like in the mid 2000s, I mean, that was completely different. So I found it hard to equate somewhere like Penrith or Campbelltown, which I'd also had, you know, some stints in, to Bankstown. I felt like they were vastly different places. So then I guess in the way I've approached writing Western Sydney, I'm a lot more specific than that. I tend not to even use terms like Western Sydney, because for me, like that's like shorthand that's used by the media, and I guess by people who are probably from outside the area. Whereas I think if I asked a lot of people living around here, I think they would find it, the idea odd that there's this thing called Western Sydney, except for in a very broad way where you're like just, you know, using it casually, but not like as something to, I guess, an idea to write for or against, let's say.
Thanks for that, Sheila. Really interesting. Ada, your take on it?
Yeah. I feel like what we're talking about now resonates with what we were sort of half kidding about earlier, right before the panel started, which was like that we were sort of discussing what our Western Sydney credentials are, and and discussing how that as a concept is in itself somewhat ridiculous and often actually a sort of offensive question for anyone to try to claim I'm from Western Sydney, as if there is a way to be Indigenous to Western Sydney unless you are actually an Aboriginal person. So, and hopefully that is part of what my essay at least was trying to do, because I found myself thinking about, or at least witnessing, this sort of rapid gentrification that I see playing out across many different parts of Western Sydney, although I talk mainly about Parramatta in the essay. I just sort of found myself thinking that if we are going to talk about Western Sydney and gentrification, we need to stop being so ahistorical. I notice in particular a lot of people of color, especially in the literary space, try to claim this area as their own or our own, in resistance to the entry of middle class or white people or yuppies into the area. But I think that's like a really inherently limited approach to try to say that we working class people of color got here first to Western Sydney is deeply ahistorical, and we need to actually orient our work around the most significant issue of liberation that we face today, which is that of Indigenous liberation. And I guess the other thing I want to quickly say is that connected to that was a desire to write Western Sydney as if materiality, material conditions, and class are what actually define being from this place. Like, call me a reactionary, but I see a lot of people try to talk about being from Western Sydney as if it were an identity marker or a culture, as if there are predefined ways of, you know, eating a kebab or whatever it is. And I think in reality, being from Western Sydney means something very material. It's a determinant of class, your job prospects, your long-term health, possibly your lifespan, whether or not your newborn is more or less likely to die at hospital. These are really material things.
Yeah, great points. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just think that when we talk about decolonization and how to do it in the context of anti-gentrification, we need to think about how to be more material. So those were like the two guiding, I guess, ethoses of the work.
Yeah, it's one of these great sort of somewhat paradoxical things. I mean, Western Sydney is something everyone talks about, and is this, you know, it's kind of a thing. But as soon as you interrogate it, as soon as you start playing around with that word, that name, well, whose optic is it? And what happens once you bring a bit of scrutiny to it? Absolutely. Sheila, you're gonna...
Well, no, yeah, no, I mean, I just wanted to, you know, agree with what Eda was saying, but also, yeah, I mean, and I guess this is my own discomfort from, I mean, I don't think in any bio you can read of me, I ever say that I'm from Western Sydney. I feel like the from is problematic. I'm happy to say I live here because this is where I live, and it's true. And I moved back to the area as an, you know, with kids now in the last couple of years, and I've been in and out of the area for a long time. But there's something I did feel very uncomfortable about the idea of trying to claim this space as though this is like my identity. For one thing, it's like quite neo-colonial, I felt, for one thing. But also, I think speaking to what Eda was saying was, but this is a rapidly changing area too, and there's lots of layers. And even now, I've spent a lot of time the last few years just walking around my local neighborhood. And I think it's very different now, this area, to what it was 20 years ago. Because the people who live here have changed. I have real estate agents knocking on my door constantly, asking if I'm selling my house, because properties are like over $1 million, and these are like 5-row homes. So I think we could take that into account when we're trying to talk about Western Sydney and not claim it as some, working class, frozen in time, place, which it is certainly not anymore.
Very interesting.
I think I just want to say, I think that that's what some of the most interesting writers in this collection and in Western Sydney are doing, are actually trying to track that change in this area and to talk about what it means to be in the midst of change. And, Western Sydney is so rapidly changing. I think of Zohra Ali's essay in particular, and the way that she managed to write about the building of a mosque. I think it was near, I can't remember where it was, near Campbelltown, I think. And the way that the debates over building that mosque spoke to a fear of change in that area. Or even someone like Raza Jamshed in her essay, Muhammad, I think did an amazing job of talking about the fact that she is one of the very few Arab Muslims in Richmond, which traditionally has been a very white area of Sydney, and capturing in a really nuanced and subtle way what that change in demographic might mean in that area and what it means to understand that you're part of that change in that demographic.
Look, yeah. The gentrification kind of transformation, I'm so reluctant to mention those two words, housing prices. It's the great Sydney, the great Sydney conversation. Let's back off from that. But this notion of, I'll constantly hear this notion, Western Sydney is changing. Western Sydney is this place in flux. Western Sydney is not what it was or what you think it was or whatever. And in your pieces and in some of the other pieces, you get a snapshot of these changes in action. One of them's kind of education, gentrification. When you were approaching your take on Western Sydney, how did you kind of figure those elements in it?
I can start. Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, I guess with my essay, it's set mostly, it's University of Sydney and then sort of other sort of settings like Glebe nearby and that. But in some ways, it is probably one of the essays where I have addressed this idea of Western Sydney the most inherently, because something that I had felt was missing for many years, following all the writing and discussion about Western Sydney, was that there was often this missing idea of social mobility. I mean, Edda writes about this as well. So I think that's the kind of
term, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and of course there are limits to education. Like, I guess I'm not so naive that I believe that education can solve everything, and that and I do think meritocracy is also limited in thinking about cutting through racial difference and things like that. But it certainly is important, because that's something that often people who are writing about Western Sydney don't seem to acknowledge their own kind of educational background. So a lot of people, who might claim from being from Western Sydney, and they might even speak of like, white supremacy and oppression and that. I mean, but a lot of these people, including myself, including Edda, who went to selective schools, we had university educations, we've had further education. I mean, I allude to the fact that I've had a couple of degrees. And I guess interestingly, it just happens that my husband grew up in the eastern suburbs, and I sort of allude to what that stands for, but he is the first person in his family to be university educated. But coming from a Vietnamese family, growing up, I personally didn't aspire to whiteness, because my family had this idea that the average white Australian was probably not very education focused. So that's kind of what I'm trying to say, like that it's a lot more simple than that. It's a lot more complex than that, rather, that Western Sydney, a lot of us growing up there, we were very aspirational, and then education for us represented, something that other people, I guess, could take for granted, because maybe that is a structural issue.
Sure, really interesting. Yeah. Guys, any responses to that? Any thoughts on?
Yeah, I think that possibly now that I'm like hearing you unpack your piece more, Sheila, I think that I'll possibly contrast, because like I am a bit, I mean, of course, I'm a bit well, anyone who knows me would say, of course, but I'm a bit like class heavy in this particular piece, and I totally take what you're saying about the prevalence of middle class people in Western Sydney very seriously, and I think that that's very true, and that the working class of Sydney is dispersed very widely across all of Sydney. But at the same time, I guess with my piece, what I was finding myself thinking a lot about was that if there is to be an essence to being from Western Sydney, it so has nothing to do with cultural signifiers and all the shitty tropes that we see in the writing about Western Sydney, but rather it has to be something material, and it has to be classed if there is an essence to it at all. But I can see that, you know, for other contributors to the anthology, yeah, you don't see there as being an essence, which makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
Perhaps everybody's connection is just kind of different. Perhaps everybody's essence is that different, you know, like I can see for a lot of like someone like Roa Aja, I think her connection to this place is really about connection to family very, very strongly. And that's in her piece. So perhaps everybody's kind of idea of what the essence of this place is a very individual thing. And that's part of what makes great writing about Western Sydney so complex. And what makes this like anthology, I think, really interesting is that we've all kind of captured different essences and different ideas of what this place means to us.
Yeah, look, and in doing that, what I think you've achieved, and we'll come to this a bit later, reading your stuff's like reading the future of what our literature can be, but I'm kind of preempting the next question a bit, so I'll lay off that a bit, but it's as if this trying to capture this, your pieces are quite nuanced and they're not this simplistic rendering of this, you know, entity, Western Sydney, whatever that is. They very effectively capture this thing in motion, which is, it's just a really interesting approach on the whole thing. But Sheila, sorry, I thought you were going to say something and I probably interrupted you, or?
Oh, I was going to just talk about what I found Rawa Aja's piece when I was revisiting the book too. It was really fascinating, actually. And I felt, yeah, there was something like very insular about the world that she described, and she's conscious of that. And I just felt it really beautifully like articulated what I felt was the kind of experience that I have seen a lot growing up in this area too. Like that often we are often quite in insular communities. I mean, that is part of the, you know, multicultural struggle really, is that we are all from very different places, different language groups, and that we coexist now, we're neighbors. I mean, I feel that a lot, you know, living now in the Bankstown area, that on my street, I think we're probably, every single house is from a different cultural background. And it actually can make it quite hard to connect across, you know, because of that in a way. So then we end up sort of in our own, you know, family units and that. So I think that's one of the interesting things that I think Rawa's piece really kind of explains really well through her own sort of family story.
It's a beautiful, like, it's a beautiful example of writing about place. What I love about that essay is that you do get that sense of like that her family are in this very small bubble, but like those beautiful images of her and her family in their backyard and the fruit trees and the uncle that's doing something in the garage is kind of cut through with like an image of like a siren or a shooting or something, or a busy street that appears just outside of that small insular bubble. And it's such a beautiful image of Western Sydney as a whole, like, and that idea that we all live in these kind of, we do actually all live in these small, very different bubbles, but they're always cut through with the world outside.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay. Guys, I'm mindful of time. I might shift our discussion onto our next discussion point, which broadens things out a bit. Look, I think we live in interesting times in Australian writing. As far as I can see, that older established idea of what constitutes Australian literature is giving away to different voices. Now, if we do agree on that, we may or may not on the scale of it. But if we do agree, why has it taken so long? It just seems to be a long time coming to me. I think I've been waiting a long time, as mentioned to people earlier. I'm of Greek background. I probably come from a different layer of the migrant story, the assimilationist period. I've been waiting a long time to see the mix up. And I'm just thrilled. It seems to finally be, kind of cresting a bit. If we agree on that, and then what role do you think writing from Western Sydney, if we agree there's such a thing, what role can it play in opening up our literature, developing our literature, making it new, as the modernists said literature should do? Big one, huh?
Felicity?
In making it new, I just think that's such a huge question, and I could look at it from so many different and also kind of contradictory angles. I think one of the things that has happened is that because the literature of Western Sydney was developed away from like the centers of literature and art, it did develop in its own unique way, and I think with its own unique kind of style and voice. One of the things I find really interesting about the writing in Western Sydney is that I think it the first kind of arts cultures in Western Sydney, because there are so many people who speak English as a second language, and because we have lower levels of literacy traditionally, is that theatre, I think, really took off. Performance and visual arts, I think, long before writing took off in this area. And I think that a lot of that kind of performative style has bled into the literature that has developed from this area. There's so many. I also think because the literature is very suburban, and that makes it different as well. Like traditionally, Australian literature is all about the city and the country. Like our really big literary debates have always been about whether or not our literature is defined by the city or the country. And, that vast, expansive suburban space is left out really a lot in our literary history. So I think that's part of it as well. And I think part of it is also, we do talk about the insularity of this place, and I think all places in Sydney are insular. But there's also something else that happens here that I don't think people talk about as much, which is that because we are away from the literary centre, a lot of writers in Western Sydney and artists in general in Western Sydney have made more of an effort, I think, to travel further and to travel to different regions and experience literature. So like I'm working on a big project at the moment in Kingswood, and all of the kind of writers and artists are mostly based in, Kingswood, Penrith, Fairfield. They don't think anything of, driving an hour and a half to another region in Sydney to go and see something or listen to something. Whereas I don't think if you are closer to that kind of epic literary centre, an hour and a half's drive is a lot to you. So you're going to be more shaped by that smaller world, which kind of speaks to one another, where everyone's speaking to one another and everybody's echoing one another. So yeah, and there would be so many reasons to why this literature, there's so many other reasons that everybody could speak to why this literature is developed differently, I think.
Well, I might answer it in a different way though, and add something to what you're saying, Felicity, is that, and I think about your generation, Tony, and other people I know who are like Italians and Greeks. If I was 10 years older and, or maybe even a little bit older than that, and I was in your generation, I might not have become a writer either. But the fact is, I'm young enough that I basically grew up with the internet, so I didn't feel the geographic limitation of Western Sydney. That's the other thing. It's not about even going to the center. Like I was able to write from my bedroom, which is what I did pretty much from a young age. So I was on the internet from my teenage years. And so I became a writer essentially because of the internet. Like it enabled, and also not just the internet, but also there are other kind of national schemes for young people as well. So when I was growing up, it wasn't really about, trying to talk about writers of color. It was about young writers. It was all these schemes throwing at money, throwing at people under 26. So that was a real thing in the kind of mid 90s to the mid 2000s. But I think the internet was a really formative, instrument in my my life really, like because I spent a lot of my teenage years and early 20s just like writing like bad music reviews and blogging and contributing to websites. Thankfully and mercifully, it's all disappeared, so you can't find that bad writing now on the internet. But I mean, that's that's the other thing too. Just because I grew up in Western Sydney, it didn't mean that I didn't have the same access in some ways. And that was the dream and the promise of the early internet, which I don't think has played out like that now. But that was a really kind of liberating space to kind of grow up in and to learn how to write.
Yeah, really good, really interesting point. One I hadn't thought of at all. The kind of porosity, the permeability of everything that comes with that. But Ada, I've seen you nodding enthusiastically. I mean, any thoughts on all of this?
I think that, I mean, both Felicity and Sheila have sort of touched on this idea that, in my view at least, I think sometimes we can, in romanticizing Western Sydney, over-egg the sense of how far away it is from the quote-unquote center. And that's like why this anthology is trying to acknowledge all the ways in which we now have a hegemonic Western Sydney writing that we now need to sort of try to dismantle. And dare I say, I'm slightly younger, although you both have wonderful youthful visages. I'm slightly younger than Felicity and Sheila, so I, in many ways, feel like when I arrived on the literary scene, the Western Sydney moment had actually already ended. Like, you know, Western Sydney was so hot as a literary trend in 2015-16. And now, and I hate that idea, of course, but I find, like, I myself have found myself saying, oh, the Western Sydney moment is over. And of course, that's a ridiculous notion because there is no one thing to writing Western Sydney. But, you know, I think that a lot of writing about Western Sydney has unfortunately given way to prioritizing types of writing that emphasize tropes about Western Sydney. You know, we're all sort of criminals or sexists or overdetermined by religion or, you know, too stupid. And this is something that frustrated me about how we spoke about the same-sex marriage debate, but the idea that people from Western Sydney are simply too stupid to be liberal. And so I think we have, unfortunately, been really saturated in this idea of a new hegemonic Western Sydney writing that I despise. But that being said, I don't really have any predetermined ideas about what this new wave, if there is a new wave of Western Sydney writing, is going to entail. But I do think that, yeah, we probably aren't as far from the centre as we would like to believe sometimes.
No, those are really good points. Sorry, Sheila, go.
So, but a lot of this discourse that, I mean, and this is another thing I guess I'm thinking about when I was reading this collection. Like, I mean, a lot of the discourse about Western Sydney, essentially, it seems to come from the media, or what people characterize as the media, as well as, I guess, literary studies or something. And I sometimes I feel like I get frustrated thinking, why do people give so much power to I know the media is powerful, but this idea of Western Sydney, so people seem to be reacting against sort of what the media says. And I guess I personally haven't taken the media that seriously, even from a young age. And I think that's because, I mean, when I think about it, it's because I did work experience from a young age at a magazine when I was in year 10 and everyone had to do that compulsory work experience. I went to a magazine and I just completely blew apart any idea I had of these people, but people that I should like necessarily look up to. So it just meant that then when I encountered that, when I went to Sydney Uni and then, you know, and then I guess I don't really write about it in this essay, but when I went to Sydney, this is when I did meet people who'd be like, oh, you're from Western Sydney or you're a Westie back then. And I'll be like, so what, you come from Lane Cove? Like, is that a lot better? Like, I didn't think so. Like, because
Lane Cove.
We've ended up in the same place. And in fact, my family did pretty well. We were refugees like only 20 years ago. So I felt like we had done pretty well to like do as much as we can. So I guess I really, maybe some part of me just really rejected what other people thought from a young age. And that helped me a lot, I suppose.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This notion of Sydney's, we'll move to, I want to get to our writerly question because I think, yeah, you're all terrific writers. But also I think the culture of the essay that's being encouraged by SRB. Were they all SRB pieces, by the way? Yeah. I mean, you know, it's your talent, your efforts, but there's also this kind of culture that SRB is developing of the innovative essay, and your pieces are really great examples of it. And we'll get to that in a minute, but just to finally wrap up on this kind of notion, I mean, where is this literary centre, by the way, in Sydney? I'm just curious. I just wanted to, where's
I actually want to clarify some of the comments that I made earlier. As somebody, you know, who's been in this space for 20 years, the Literary Centre was definitely not here, but now I would argue it probably is. I mean, literally, I live in the centre of Sydney, in Parramatta. But also, I think now we have a very strong literary culture in Parramatta and the surrounds. So when I talk about the centre, I guess maybe I'm talking about it historically, really.
You mean like the traditional publishing houses?
Yeah, and I think we should also acknowledge that, like, part of getting published and getting acknowledged and getting your voice out there is kind of being networked
I get you.
into kind of the people who have the power to acknowledge you and publish you. And part of, I think, what has historically disadvantaged writers in Western Sydney has been far less access to those networks, which are more readily available if you are a writer in the inner city. But I definitely think that's changing, and I definitely think, you know, a lot of publishers and places are very actively seeking out Western Sydney writers. But you know, as Etta particularly said before, that can be really problematic as well, because they're often looking for a kind of authentic voice that is like perhaps more of a performance.
Absolutely. I think that's a very good point. Yeah, absolutely.
But
Sheila, go on, and then I'll.
So you're specifically talking about, like, I guess you could call it like high literary culture, though. Really, like, we're talking about books. We're talking about, I mean, when I think about writing, I think writing much more broadly than that, because I think that's what, and you said that before, but like the Western suburbs have been very fertile for like poetry, performance, other kinds of writing. Like I said, and like I said, when I thought about the internet, maybe the internet for me personally never made me feel that limited, because I could just write something and publish it straight away. So I think it's more this, what we're talking about, more traditional publishing culture, like of books and events and all of that, but not other forms. And that's why you see quite a good representation of those other forms in this area.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, kind of the democratization of writing that happened in the noughties and the tens. Guys, I want to make some time to talk about your. It's kind of a craft question, but I don't like that word. But anyway, because that you really do really interesting things with the essay forms. Sheila, I loved your use of, you know, kind of Maclaren Hall, the Grand Hall at Sydney Uni, and John Howard, and using that as a departure point for reflections. Ada, your essay had, you know, intellectual kind of excursions into the Situationists, like Guy Debord, if I remember correctly, and, you know, working at a Church Street restaurant. Felicity, you had those wonderful reflections on Virginia Woolf and you know, going everything from houses to, you know, to whatever. The diversity of form I found really, really thrilling and exciting. Can you just talk a little bit about, I mean, how do you pull something like that off? How do you get all those diverse elements working together into a satisfying essay form, as you've also successfully done?
Yeah, well, I'll start. Yeah, no, I think, yeah, for me, like, I guess I really enjoy writing essay. I guess it reflects something about how I try to, you know, deal with problems in my own life too, like in terms of how I think through problems and create structure. I think like writing straight memoir can be very limiting and difficult in that way. It's hard to write memoir really well. Whereas essay, and in my case, it's basically personal essay. It's a series of kind of interrelated observations and as well as reportage, because it just happened that I was there on what I felt like it was a historic day with John Howard being given like an honorary doctorate, and then all these things were unfolding. And I remember by the end of that day, I thought, I've got to write about this. This is a really important moment. It just happened to kind of, you know, connect with my own history as well. Yeah, and so I think the essay form is really exciting because there are so many different ways to approach it. But personally, I think what differentiates memoir from essay is something around the structure and this kind of analytical aspect, which memoir is powerful in a different way, because memoir is much more kind of emotional, whereas essay I would consider a little bit more analytical. It's kind of how I think of it anyway.
Okay, good point. Yeah, very interesting take on it. Yeah, they can be quite they suggest different things. Yeah. Felicity, Eda, any thoughts on that?
I think about it a bit differently. For me, when I'm writing essays, I'm in my head, I'm trying to come up with a kind of visual metaphor for writing something that is very personal, but also very analytical. Like I often think about the personal essay or creative nonfiction, whatever you want to call it, something in that vein. I think about it as being, something like a helix, like looking like a helix or looking like a rhizome or looking, like a kind of scatter map. For me, it's about trying to work out what that personal thread is, and then trying to bring in all of that other worldly stuff that validates your own personal story. I think, and Sheila and I have had long conversations about how kind of self-indulgent a lot of memoir is. And I think that that's because people don't show the significance of their own story through bringing in all those different kinds of threads of research and analysis, which are outside of themselves, which is why when I write the personal essay, I have a lot of, I quote literary theory and I quote popular culture. And it's that I think allows me to validate my own personal experience and also to show that, my Western Sydney experience is also a national experience and an international experience as well.
Okay, thanks. Ada, your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I feel very similarly. I suppose possibly we all like to do that sort of pastiche of, or for me at least, the things I generally tend to stitch together are a few anecdotes that I think seem to revolve around the central theme well enough, or speak to that theme from my personal experience, and then, a few quotes from possibly whatever it is I'm reading at the time, and pieces of critical theory that I think sort of animate my thinking, or connect that thinking to like a broader politic. And then for me at least, I just insert a couple of crude jokes about sex and then wanting to kill myself. And then you have my personality, my writing personality in a bottle. But yeah, I don't know. Like, I guess sometimes, therefore, I'll go back and read my work and feel like it's a bit tonally uneven. Like, sometimes it does a lot of telling, being quite strident with an argument, and then sometimes doing a lot of showing and being very subdued in terms of not holding the reader's hand as to how to interpret the information that's included. But that being said, I've never studied craft, and I know you hate that word, Tony.
No, I don't hate it. We've never been friends.
And I don't profess to be a very good craft person, and to that end, I therefore think that often it's the audience who brings the insight to the work. I just happen sometimes to be alive to the concerns that people my generation or people who share like life experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That ability to make connections in your piece I found extremely dexterous. The leaps, they're risky, but it gelled, it worked. And it's very interesting, this notion of the essay is usually considered something in the telling mode, by definition. But you're all very good at putting in the emblematic anecdote, if I could call it that. The anecdote that, says, that looks a little innocent, but really isn't. Is very resonant and that can move to larger themes. I mean, how do you develop an eye for that? Or does it just come natural?
Any writer, oh, sorry. You go.
I don't know what I was going to say. No, I was going to say it's probably a bit of both. I mean, I guess you could argue whether, you're born with it or not, but I think it's something, a kind of combination, because if you're someone who's very observant, that helps a lot with being a good writer as well, or being drawn to writing. But then the more you do it, the better you get at it. And so when you see something happen or a line, you recognize it straight away for what it is. And then you're probably furiously writing down in a note or something that I've got to catch this later in an essay or something.
Sure. Felicity, you're going to
I was just going to say, any writer that says it like it's all comes naturally and it comes naturally on the page is like completely full of shit.
They're trying to psych you out. That's what they're trying to do.
I mean, I think all writing is editing, and like it's, you know, you put that stuff down on the page and then you play with it and you rearrange it and you make it different and you try and work out what works.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the noticing is kind of something that is hard to teach, though, isn't it? Like
yes, yeah.
That's the stuff
particularly in the present day.
Yeah, so like then being able to notice, you know, it's like a really radical act for one thing, and that's where the magic can be sometimes.
Guys, I'm mindful of time. We're on a 1:45, and I think I'll probably better open it up for questions, if that's okay with everybody. Rebecca, you there? We're gonna open up for questions from the floor.
A few questions there I can see in the Q&A. Can you see at the bottom of the screen?
Okay. Okay, here we go. Q&A. I've got 2 so far. Okay. Okay, here's a good one from Duncan Bainbridge. Duncan asks, when did the Western suburbs become middle class? Middle with a capital M.
That might have been something that we talked about earlier, I think, Etta, or something, that maybe that's where that question comes from.
Yeah.
It's hard to answer that question succinctly, but I guess one thing I would say is that I think that, again, the Western suburbs is a huge geographic area, and it encompasses many different classes, for one thing. Possibly not upper class, if that exists at all in Australia. But one thing I felt personally, and I think this is something that's missing from the discourse, is that, I mean, I grew up probably with something more like a mixed class identity. And I think this is very common with people who are, you know, I guess migrant backgrounds, who basically, and especially if you're not white, obviously that you kind of drop a class when you migrate as well. You often have to sort of start again in some way. So my parents were working, like had working class jobs to some extent, but very quickly that was shed as well for more like, you know, small business owners, like the more like middle class people. And I felt I even understood, even without having the terminology, that this emphasis on education and bettering yourself, I felt was kind of a middle class trait. And so I recognized that already even in my kind of early years. So that mixed class sort of narrative is sometimes not really described very well, I think. It's often you're either working class or middle class, but it's not really as simple as that for a lot of us.
I often think that there's this huge swathe of like particularly Western suburbs middle classness that is completely missing from the discourse in exactly that way that Sheila described. But also when I think about this question, I think about, you know, the kilometers and kilometers and kilometers of McMansion communities that exist, you know, like right on the edge of Parramatta and all the kind of larger city places in Western Sydney, you know, and a lot of those neighborhoods are dominated by, you know, tradies, but tradies who make more than professors, much more than professors. And it's a different kind it's a very different kind of middle class, I think, than a middle class that might exist in a different area.
But to that end, it therefore depends how you define class, right? Like if pushing back against the idea of class as culture, we can see that simply being a tradie, which is like a working class quoted job, isn't the same thing as being working class, which is why we have to emphasize materialism and Felicity. I just think that was a really good point about McMansions that you make in No More Boats, that if I'm getting my timeline correct, I was thinking about as I was writing my essay that's in Second City, because as much as we like to talk about Western Sydney being a working class space, which, don't get me wrong, in many ways is, you know, the fact that there is such a large migrant population in the area specifically dovetails with the goals of settler colonialism, which was that this massive space, we basically needed to invent the suburbs here in order to better colonize this continent. And so people do own, you know, the Australian dream of the detached home. That is a very middle class Australian dream, and that Australian dream intersects strongly with white supremacy. So I don't know, and I'm struggling to know how to read the tone of this question. Part of me thinks that you're asking when did the Western suburbs become middle class? And then the other part of me thinks that perhaps you're asking it in a more neutral way.
Well,
Yeah.
Duncan as well. I have to say he likes the concept of mixed class. He's from Ryde, and I think Ryde is a very interesting suburb to demonstrate that the mixed classness, which is something I feel a lot moving back to the area. Yeah.
Maybe we should find the first McMansion and turn it into some sort of attraction. It's just a random thought. And whether it's in Western Sydney, you know.
I know exactly. It's Old Government House in the middle.
Good one.
That was absolutely the first McMansion in Sydney.
I would love to just drink a glass of wine or something in the Old Government House.
Guys, I'll move on. Next question's from Mike Costello. I'll try to do it justice with summarising it because it's quite long. It's a very good question. If we kind of agree that we can make a claim that there's a unique style of voice, performative, suburban concept of place people coming out of Western Sydney, what would then characterise this future literature? Apologies, Moya. I'm mindful of time, and I'm just trying to condense it a bit. Was that clear at all, guys? Yeah. Okay.
I think that question is about what is Australia really as well. I mean, it's an incredibly like a hyper multicultural place, much more multicultural than most places on the planet, with other kind of similar kind of settler colonial kind of places, I think. So that I think that our literature, I hope, will reflect that, because that's been the problem, right? It's not really reflected the true diversity and the true hybridity, I guess, of a place like Australia. And I think that we're seeing more and more of that, though, which is really exciting. I think that probably is also a class issue too, that more of us are now have the means to become, contribute writing and become writers as well. Whereas maybe in a previous generation, people were like, working in the kind of jobs that wouldn't allow for this sort of to happen. But now we're more educated and have the means as well. So I guess, for Moya's question, I feel like it's all those things. I don't know that we can answer that easily.
Interesting. Felicity, did you want to go at that one or move on, or any thoughts on?
Oh, I was just going to make a joke prediction that has to do with what Felicity was saying earlier about the Australian literary preoccupation with like cities and towns. I think we also should have specifically said coastal towns. Australians are obsessed with the coast.
Absolutely.
Felicity, the other day you were saying, actually, there are other wet parts of Australia that have rivers. So I think the next big wave of Australian writing is going to be river-centric, lake-centric.
That's already come, though. There's been a whole spate of writing about the Hawkesbury
River.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that's come. Well, the moment's passed.
Darn, I'm so sorry. I tried.
Okay, let's do maybe one or maybe two more. I just want to.
Some good questions.
Yeah, they're good questions.
Let's play something. Look, Emily Tran's got a pithy question. Do you think it's easier to write about Western Sydney when it's jumped? It's gone.
When you move away from there.
Well done. When you no longer live in Western Sydney. Is it easier to write about when you no longer live there? Great James Joyce thing of writing about Dublin when you haven't been there in 50 years. Not 50, but whatever.
Personally, I don't think that's really I think it's much easier to write it when you're living there, actually. I think it's different for me when I think about something like, what does it mean to be Vietnamese? That's much more difficult to write, and maybe being away from family makes that a lot easier. But the Western Sydney thing, moving back to the area has just given me a lot more observations and more to think about. So I don't really kind of personally think that that's what I think about Western Sydney, because it's not so fraught for me. It's just part of where I've grown up and part of my identity in a very natural and intrinsic way. So I don't feel like I don't need space from it in that way, for me personally.
I think that most writers I know writing about Sydney Western Sydney have moved in or out of it at various points. And I think that is quite useful to be able to look at a place through comparison with other places. Actually, I think Luke Carman does that really well in The Scenes of an Elegant Young Man, when he talks about the differences between the inner city culture he experiences at some points in his life and the Western suburbs culture that he's come from. And I don't know that he would necessarily be able to define some of those differences if he didn't spend time living in each of those cultures. I feel like part of what helps me to notice and observe things here that are unique to this place, to the Parramatta region, is kind of even just like going away for a week somewhere and coming back and there's something that kind of startles you or hits you in the face.
Okay.
I think that's sort of the challenge where, you definitely need distance in order to be able to appraise what you're actually looking at. Not to talk about water again, but the fish needs to leave the ocean to know that water is wet or whatever. But at the same time, I think that the challenge that comes out of that is then finding ways to write the place that you're no longer in without exoticizing it or putting some kind of filter of time.
Or keeping it in the past, like making it ahistorical, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, guys, time for one more. I've got a choice between two here. Look, I'll go with Jason Poulos. I hope I'm describing this nicely, but are you okay to be classified as cultural, diverse or minority writers, or however the industry classifies you?
I think you guys should start with that. I don't consider myself a minority writer, that phrase is so weird because I actually do come from a very culturally diverse family, but I would never wear the tag of cultural diversity because I guess it has, I would never tick that box because I think it has connotations that don't belong to me and aren't of me as somebody who walks in the world as a white person and is a white person.
I do have a problem with how other people might choose to characterize me. Of course, like the lived reality is that I am from a minority background in Australia, but not in a global context. So that's something I'm very clear about. And so I also don't hyphenate myself either. If I had to, if you pushed me, I'd say, yes, I'm Vietnamese Australian. But actually, that's why I actually use my middle name as well, just to emphasize that I speak another language, that I come from a culturally diverse background, if you want to use that terminology, and that it's inherent to, my name. But it's very difficult navigating that, and it's a whole other conversation we could have about in terms of the industry. I think that's what the question alludes to, and I think the industry is still quite limited in its thinking of the possibilities of difference, and how that contributes to a very rich writing culture in Australia.
Yeah, look, those are such interesting responses. Anna, some thoughts there, and we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I guess my honest answer is I don't really care because I don't control how the industry classifies me, and I'm aware that they will go ahead and do whatever they want and put our work in boxes if they so wish. But I guess I write to my community, and that's a different conversation.
Yeah, look, in kind of just a really quick reflection on that, you've got this tension between the way book markets work and the way the media works, which is in terms of reductive classifications, and then your own desire to, be who you are and write what you want. And the tension between those two is ever present, and how you negotiate it it's kind of never going to go away. To me, it's a bit of an occupational hazard. But anyway, guys, I think we'd better wrap up. I could talk all night to the three of you. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I've learned a great deal, and it's been a real pleasure to meet you and to enjoy your terrific writing. Thanks so much, everybody. And we'll wrap up there. I'll applaud for our writers.
Thank you, Tony, too.
And thanks so much for joining us tonight too. It was really helpful to answer those questions.
Okay, guys. Rebecca, I think we sign out at this point, yeah? Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you.
I can send you all good bookstores.
Yes.
The book.
Available in all good bookshops.
The book.
Look at that millennial pink cover. How can one?
Okay, well, I'm going to leave now.